Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be talking about how to read a book.
It's a classic.
It is How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler.
And Charles Van Doren.
And Charles Van Doren.
Yep.
And this is one that I think I've looked at it at various points in my life and kind of skimmed it. But I'm really excited to kind of dig in with you and see what we can get out of it, because one of the things that they talk about in the book is that there are different levels of reading.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important, because we often think about reading as just like, well, I'm reading the words.
Right.
I'm looking at the page and I'm seeing the letters and I'm making the sounds in my head or out loud or whatever.
Right.
But there's so much more to it than that.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that makes this book so valuable, is that it really breaks down those different levels of reading and makes you aware of the processes that you can use to become a more effective reader.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think is really interesting too is that they talk about how, reading is not just about like passively absorbing information.
Right.
It's not just like sitting there and letting the words wash over you.
Right.
It's about actively engaging with the text. And
yes.
And I think, we're going to talk about inspectional reading in a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think even that is a more active form of reading than what a lot of people are used to.
Yeah, definitely. And the different levels of read. I mean, they start with just like, being able to recognize the words on the page, and to make sense of those.
Right.
And then it goes all the way up to like synoptical reading, where you're reading multiple books on the same topic and kind of comparing and contrasting.
Right.
So it's really, I think it's really helpful to have that framework.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, where am I in my reading journey, and how can I kind of level up?
And I think for most people, and we're talking about a book called How to Read a Book.
Right.
It's like most people listening to this have probably gotten past elementary reading.
Right.
But, I think that there are levels beyond that.
Yes.
That are really valuable to explore and can really enhance your understanding of any text that you're reading.
Right.
So that's a good place to kind of jump off into that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about inspectional reading, because that's kind of the first level that they talk about beyond just the basic, recognizing the words.
Right. So inspectional reading is kind of like,
yeah.
When you go to a bookstore and you're looking at a book and you're trying to decide if you want to buy it.
Right.
You're not going to sit down and read the whole thing.
No.
You're going to kind of flick through it.
Right.
You're going to look at the cover.
Right.
You're going to read the back cover.
Right.
You might skim the table of contents.
Yes.
Just to get a sense of what the book is about.
Yeah, like, is this something that I'm even interested in?
Right. And that's kind of what inspectional reading is all about.
Yeah.
It's about getting a sense of the book as a whole.
Right.
Before you actually commit to reading it in depth.
Yes.
And so there are a few different techniques that you can use for inspectional reading.
Okay.
One is to, skim the table of contents, what we talked about.
Yeah.
Another is to read the preface or the introduction, if there is one.
Mm-hmm.
And then another is to kind of just flip through the book.
Okay.
And look for any headings or subheadings or bold text or anything that kind of stands out.
Yeah, any clues.
Right, because those are going to give you a sense of the main points that the author's trying to make.
Right.
And you can also look at the index to see what kind of topics are covered in the book.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially if you're looking for a specific, like if you're doing research on something and you need to find out, does this book even talk about this topic? The index is so helpful for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that idea of like just kind of getting a preview before you dive in.
Right.
And one of the things that they talk about in the book is that this can actually help you to read more effectively when you do actually sit down and read the book.
Yeah.
Because you have a better sense of what to expect.
Exactly. Because you're kind of priming your brain.
Right.
You're giving it a little bit of context.
Yes.
So that when you start reading the actual text, you're not just coming in cold.
Right.
You're already kind of familiar with the terrain.
Yeah, you have a map.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so inspectional reading, we take a look at the book. We get a feel for it. We see if it's something that we even want to spend our time on.
Right.
And then what's the next step?
So the next step is to start reading more actively.
Okay.
And so this is where we get into the idea of like having a conversation with the author. Instead of just passively absorbing their words.
Right.
you're actually engaging with them. You're asking questions. You're making connections. You're underlining things. You're taking notes.
Yes.
All of that.
I love that idea of having a conversation with the author, because I think so often we think of reading as like this one-way,
Right.
transmission of information.
Right.
But it can be so much more dynamic than that.
Exactly. And the more actively you engage with the text, the more you're going to get out of it.
Right.
If you're just passively reading,
Yeah.
it's very easy to just kind of let it wash over you and not really retain anything.
Or it's like watching TV or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, you might be entertained in the moment, but then you don't really remember what you watched.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're actively engaging with the text, you're much more likely to remember it and actually understand it.
And to make those connections to other things that you've read or to your own life or to
Exactly.
know the world around you.
Yeah. And that's really where the real learning happens.
Yes.
It's not just about absorbing information. It's about making those connections and integrating that information into your own understanding of the world.
So how do we actually do that?
How do we actually do that?
Yeah, like what are some specific techniques that we can use to be more active readers?
So one of the most basic techniques is just to underline or highlight key passages.
Yeah, I remember doing that a lot in school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Especially if you're trying to remember specific information.
Right. Or if you're going back to the text later to like study for a test or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you can also take it a step further and actually make notes in the margins.
Okay.
And this is where you can start to really engage with the author.
Okay.
You can ask questions. You can write down your own thoughts. You can make connections to other things that you've read.
Right. And it becomes like your own personal copy of the book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a great way to kind of track your own thinking as you're reading.
Yes.
And then another technique that Adler and Van Doren recommend is to try to identify the key sentences in each paragraph.
Okay.
And so they argue that most paragraphs have one sentence that kind of encapsulates the main idea.
Mm.
And if you can identify that sentence, then you can really unlock the meaning of the whole paragraph.
Right. So it's a little treasure hunt.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're underlining, we're taking notes, we're looking for those key sentences.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
So another thing you can do is to create a kind of roadmap of the author's argument.
Okay.
And so this is where you start to pay attention to the structure of the book.
Okay.
How are the chapters organized? How are the ideas flowing together?
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually create a little outline or a mind map or whatever works for you.
Yeah.
Just to kind of capture the main points and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got some great techniques here
Mm-hmm.
for being more active readers, and I think that's so important.
Yes.
But I'm curious to hear more about like how do we take this to the next level?
Yeah. So that's where we get into analytical reading.
Okay.
Which we'll talk about in the next part of this deep dive.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
I'm excited to level up even more.
We too.
All right, we'll be back in just a moment.
Sounds good. All right, so we're back and ready to dive into analytical reading.
Yes. Bring on the analysis.
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because analytical reading is all about taking those active reading techniques that we talked about in the last part.
Right.
And using them to really dig into the text and understand the author's argument.
Okay, so it's like we've got our tools now. We're going to put them to use.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah. So one of the first things that Adler and Van Doren emphasize in analytical reading is the importance of understanding the structure of the book.
Okay.
So we talked about inspectional reading in the last part, where you're kind of skimming the table of contents and the index.
Right.
Just getting a feel for the book.
Right. But analytical reading goes a step further.
Oh,
and
wow.
it's about really paying attention to how the author has organized their thoughts.
So it's like going from looking at a map to actually navigating the terrain.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So, you want to pay attention to the chapters, the headings, the subheadings, all of that.
Okay.
Because those are going to give you clues about the author's main arguments and how the ideas flow together.
Right. So it's like you're becoming an architect of the text.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're building that framework for your understanding.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah. And as you become more familiar with the structure, you'll be able to navigate the text more easily and find the information that you need more quickly.
That would certainly save me a lot of time and frustration.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we're paying attention to the structure. What else should we be doing when we're reading analytically?
So another important rule is to come to terms with the author.
Okay, what does that mean?
So this is about identifying the key words and phrases that are crucial to understanding the author's message.
Okay.
So sometimes authors will use words in unique ways,
Right.
or they'll have specific terms that carry a lot of weight in their argument.
Right, like jargon almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And so it's important to pay attention to those words and to make sure that you understand how the author is using them.
So it's like learning a new language.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's not just about understanding the dictionary definition of a word.
Okay.
It's about understanding how the author is using that word in context.
Right. What are they trying to get across?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of how this might work in practice?
So let's say you're reading a book about political philosophy,
Okay.
and the author keeps using the term social contract.
Okay.
Now, you might have a general idea what that means,
Right.
but the author might be using it in a very specific way.
Right.
That's crucial to their argument.
So you'd want to pay close attention to how they define and use that term throughout the book.
Right, so it's like creating a glossary as you go.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
So we're paying attention to the structure. We're coming to terms with the author.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else we should be doing?
So the next rule is don't criticize until you fully understand.
Okay.
And I love this rule
Yeah.
because it's so important.
Yeah.
It's very easy to just kind of read something and immediately jump to a judgment.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that.
Right. But Adler and Van Doren really emphasize the importance of understanding an argument before you criticize it.
So it's not about blindly accepting or
Right.
rejecting the author's ideas,
Exactly.
but it's about really engaging with them
Yeah.
thoughtfully.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and this is where critical thinking really comes into play.
Okay.
It's about being able to analyze information, objectively identify biases and assumptions.
And form your own independent conclusions.
It's like being a lawyer preparing for a trial.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
need to understand the other side's argument
Mhm.
before you can really effectively challenge it.
Exactly. And just like a good lawyer or a good reader doesn't just look for weaknesses in the argument.
Okay.
They also look for strengths.
Right.
They try to understand why the author believes what they believe.
Even if they ultimately disagree.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
So even if you end up disagreeing with the author, this process can help you to refine your own thinking
Exactly.
and develop stronger arguments.
Yeah, and that's really the goal of analytical reading.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding what the author is saying.
Right.
It's about using that understanding to develop your own critical thinking skills.
This is all starting to feel less like reading and more like mental weightlifting.
Uh-huh. I love that.
But in a good way.
Right.
Like I'm strengthening those critical thinking muscles.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Adler and Van Doren want us to do,
Yeah.
to become more active, engaged, discerning readers.
I love it. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here with analytical reading, but I know there's one more level that we haven't talked about yet.
Synoptical reading.
Yes, tell me everything.
Okay, we'll dive into that in the next part of this deep dive.
Can't wait. I'm ready to reach the final level.
Me too. Yeah, we'll be right back. All right, so we are back.
Back for more reading adventures.
That's right.
So we've talked about inspectional reading, we've talked about analytical reading, and now it's time for the big one.
The boss level.
Yes, synoptical reading.
Synoptical reading.
I'm a little intimidated.
It sounds intimidating, but it's actually a lot of fun.
Okay.
So basically, synoptical reading is about taking everything that we've learned about inspectional reading and analytical reading and applying it to multiple books on the same subject.
Okay, so it's not just about reading deeply.
Right. It's about reading widely as well.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about synthesizing information from multiple sources, comparing and contrasting different perspectives, and ultimately forming a comprehensive understanding of a topic.
I can see how this would be essential for research projects or for anyone who really wants to dive deep into a subject.
Right.
But it sounds incredibly time-consuming.
It can be.
Yeah.
But it's also incredibly rewarding.
Okay.
It's like building a mental map of a whole field of knowledge.
Yeah.
With each book contributing a new piece to the puzzle.
So it's not about speed reading or cramming as much information as possible into your brain.
Right.
It's about taking the time to really understand and connect the dots.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's ultimately what How to Read a Book is all about.
Yeah.
It's about becoming a more thoughtful, engaged, and discerning reader.
No matter what you're reading.
Exactly.
I love that.
Yeah.
This has been an amazing deep dive. Yeah, it's been fun.
I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too.
And I'm really excited to start putting these techniques into practice.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me is just to be more aware of how I'm reading.
Right.
To ask myself those key questions.
Yeah.
To take the time to underline and make notes, and to not be afraid to challenge the author, form my own opinions.
I love that. Yeah, because I think so often we just kind of passively consume information.
Right.
But when we really engage with it critically, that's when the real learning happens.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
I think I can speak for both of us when I say we've learned a lot from this deep dive into how to read a book.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for you listening, I encourage you to pick up a copy of How to Read a Book and embark on your own journey to reading mastery.
It's a great book.
It is until next time. Happy reading.
Like, comment, and subscribe.